For the sake of time, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Understand that our world is plagued by war, unavoidable war. Even if you look at the last 50 years, even in peaceful times, situations, there have been scenarios where military of the country have been deployed in other places. Constantly, military operations tend to happen. And even if that doesn't happen around border skirmishes, in these situations, you need to constantly deploy soldiers in that regard, right? Um, what we claim on the government side is hiring exclusively national soldiers often at times is problematic, especially in sensitive situations. Rejecting, uh, uh, give me a second. Um, Preventing nations from hiring mercenaries in this regard is problematic often at times because it's often better for these nation states to deploy mercenaries in particular sensitive situations rather than their own national soldiers. We claim that people fighting in these wars are biased. They often join it through mechanisms of bias, which may be things like nationalism, which may be things like supporting their country. And often at that times they're like improperly trained before being deployed into these situations, especially during times, especially through processes like conscriptions, especially during times that are more traumatic, that are more like sensitive and traumatic and like war prone, right? A big example of this is US soldiers in Iraq after 9/11, who were just going into Iraq constantly abusing their power solely because a lot of them had nationalistic state in their head that, oh, this state came, like there are terrorists hiding here who caused people in the United States to die and so on, right? So we'll make two sets of argument in this debate. The first one is going to be the idea of efficient war, which we believe is related to the idea of a just war. We claim that using mercenaries in sensitive situations can often lead to efficient warfare and even efficient military operations. Even if it's not a war-prone situations. Our second argue, and we claim that this is more likely to lead to just war, like efficient war in certain situations can lead to just war. And our second argument that we'll be making is going to be about soldiers, the state soldiers as stakeholders, who is more better prone to deal with the horrors of war, mercenaries or people who are like being hired through these processes to go around and take part, right? So let's first start with efficient war, right? Understand that mercenaries are people who are constantly being hired for this part. Like they specifically uh, they have like a lot of experience. Like you can't be a mercenary just starting out, like to be hired by a national state. Often at times they're better to use trained soldiers with experience, and they have better in check with dealing with these sort of like scenarios, right? Also understand that having a contract based sort of mechanism allows for easier mode of instruction. That is like you can easily hold them accountable in these scenarios. You can easily like dictate the terms of services that they need to follow. But most importantly, often at times they'll have lack of bias as people from your own nations, people from your own national army may be, especially working through these like turbulent situations, right? Like they're less likely to resort to like unfair violence or like excessive violence in these situations if they don't need to, if that's been commanded to them, right? Unlike people who might be torn by their emotions. Finally, it's easy to deploy them, like because like they are unaffected politically, often in scenarios, in situations where you don't have to worry about like internal political strife about like deploying soldiers in a particular area. Often at times it might be better to deploy soldiers in particular area, even if not for the sake of war, but for the sake of deterrence. We believe it's easier to deploy these soldiers in particular areas and so on. So like why is like efficient war relevant? Clearly there's a direct sort of relation, right? Like more efficient war means lesser number of lives lost on both standard. But even like if you remove war sort of scenario, even if you look at just like patrolling and active military operations around the borders, having more efficient troops means that there's less likelihood of a small like sort of manifestation changing into like a fully blown skirmish or like a much more extreme military operation, right? and that this has some particular impacts, right? Like as we've talked about, it leads to quick completion of war, leads to prevention of unnecessary deaths, and it also leads to prevention of prolonging of war, right? Like if war is uh, efficient, you're not going to have an extremely long period of time going through war. Those are direct like relations in these regards. Our second argument is going to be about the psyche of soldiers, right? Understand that taking a life can be traumatic. Often at times, soldiers will be plunged into these scenarios with inefficient training, specifically if there's like higher need of soldiers, or if it's through process like conscription and Korea, like deployment in these situations is unavoidable. Taking life in these scenarios can be traumatic. Even hesitating to taking a life can be traumatic when you're letting a soldier in your troop, in your like regiment, die in this regard, right? So in these scenarios, both these situations are likely to cause long-term trauma in like untrained or lesser trained, or even like soldiers with like even a decent amount of training, right? We think it's problematic to throw them into like really sensitive situations where their sort of action can determine the whole sake of war. It can lead to, and it's just like putting someone who does any kind of job into a really high pressure situation where them fucking up could mean loss of lives of so many people, right? We believe mercenaries are better suited to do this, and they're better suited to like take care of like those sort of needs in these regards, right? Like people with experience are more likely to perform in high pressure situations, and that means their training, their experience, their better hold, the contractual nature is likely to lead to them being able to support that. We believe like people who are just entering the army, people who don't have a lot of experience, and people who have a lot of bias are likely to perform actions that they'll later regret, that will later cause them trauma. Often at times, these are kids who will just enter army right straight off the bat. They are the most vulnerable group. Often at times, they shouldn't be put in situations as such, right? So we do think mercenaries, soldiers are going to be likely to be worst actors because of their inexperience and antipathy they often have towards the other groups. We believe in this sort of situation, like mercenaries having apathy is better than antipathy. It helps with efficient completion of war, and their experience can lead to like smaller wars, which often means just war. Thank you, and proud to propose.